All right, so today we're really diving deep into a pretty heavy chapter, really. We're talking 1930s, the Great Depression, bread lines, the whole picture.
Yeah, a time most people think they know, but
But we're going beyond the usual stories, the Dust Bowl kind of thing. We're going to dig into something many textbooks kind of gloss over, the Mexican repatriation.
right, and it's surprisingly relevant even now. Basically, we're looking at a period where huge numbers, like 400,000, maybe even 2 million people of Mexican descent were sent back to Mexico.
Whoa, wait, 2 million, that's enormous.
Yeah.
What was going on that caused like a mass exodus like that? Was it purely the Depression or was there more to it?
It's like a perfect storm situation in a bad way, of course. So you've got the depression, right, that creates this whole atmosphere of fear. People are scared, resources are tight.
It makes sense, everyone's on edge.
Exactly. And unemployment is through the roof. Folks are desperate. And sadly, but predictably, Mexican workers, many of whom, by the way, were American citizens, they became the scapegoats.
Ah, so they're being blamed for the economic problems, even though, like you said, many had been here, what, generations probably.
Absolutely, generations. And on top of that, you have this rise of nativism, basically the idea that America's for, quote unquote, native-born citizens only.
Right. So that prejudice, combined with the whole economic panic of the time, it's like a recipe for, well, for discrimination, basically.
Exactly. It's fertile ground for that kind of thinking to take root.
So it's like people needed someone to blame, and Mexican Americans, they became the easy target.
Exactly, a very easy target. And the really tragic part is it wasn't just talk, it wasn't just hateful rhetoric, it became action. You had mass roundups, families ripped apart, people forced to leave because they were threatened with deportation.
Wow, so it got really bad really fast, it sounds like.
It did. It's a dark chapter for sure. And it wasn't, happening in the shadows or anything. This was local governments, like in places like Los Angeles, Detroit, big cities. They were actually organizing these roundups and deportations.
Wow, so this was like systematic. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents here and
Oh,
there.
absolutely systematic. We're talking about there are accounts, really chilling ones, from that time. People taken from their homes, from work, even public parks, just scooped up, and often without any real, legal process, due process.
Man, that's just, I can't imagine that kind of fear, that uncertainty, just being targeted for what, your family background? It's awful. Did anybody try to stop this? Did the federal government, did they step in at all?
Well, from what the sources show, the deportations themselves, they were mostly organized locally. But the thing is, the federal government, Hoover was president then, they didn't exactly try hard to stop it, let's say that.
So they basically just, what, turned a blind eye while American citizens were being driven out of their own homes?
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And it gets even more messed up because it wasn't always like straight up deportation. There was this immense pressure, this climate of fear that really pushed families to leave, quote unquote, voluntarily. But, it wasn't really voluntary when you think about it.
Yeah.
It was coercion, plain and simple. The threat of deportation that was always hanging over their heads.
Man, the choices these families had to make, it's just heartbreaking to think this happened in America, the land of the free, home of the brave, all that. It's just a huge contradiction.
Yeah, a very bitter irony. And here's the thing, this wasn't just a blip, a one-time thing. These deportations, they kept happening even after Hoover, even during the New Deal under Roosevelt.
Really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, federal agencies, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, they got involved, often working right alongside local authorities. And often they just bypass the usual legal channels, the proper procedures.
So it really does sound like a concerted effort, like a systemic effort to just remove anyone of Mexican descent, regardless of whether they are citizens or not. That's a huge breach of trust between a government and its people.
It absolutely is. And the human cost, I mean, it's incalculable, really. The sources we have, they paint this really devastating picture, families ripped apart, lives uprooted. And then there's the trauma, deep trauma that gets passed down, intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
We're not just talking numbers on a page here. We're talking about real people, individuals, families, whole communities who helped build this country. Many, they had deep roots here. Their kids were born here, American citizens. It's a tragedy.
And just to be super clear, for everyone, this wasn't just about undocumented immigrants or anything like that. We're talking about American citizens, folks who had the right to be here, being targeted, kicked out, just because of their heritage. It's wrong.
You're totally right. It's a chilling thing, really. The Mexican repatriation, it shows us something, a really tough truth about about us, about humans. When things get rough, when there's fear in the air, anxiety gripping everyone, it's like it's always the most vulnerable who end up the scapegoats, the ones seen as different somehow.
So in this case, Mexican Americans, it didn't matter if they were citizens or not. They were the reason for all the economic troubles, at least in the minds of some folks. It makes you think how quickly prejudice can take hold, even in a country in America where freedom and justice, that's supposed to be the whole point, right?
Right, exactly. And the real tragedy of it all is the repercussions of what happened then with repatriation. They're still felt today. Many of the folks who were deported, they never really recovered from that experience, from the trauma of it all.
Yeah. And can you blame them? Imagine being ripped away from your home, everything you've built, everything you know taken away, and then sent to a place, to Mexico, where for many it wasn't even familiar, it wasn't welcoming. It's unfathomable.
It is. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around. And what makes it even worse, even more tragic, is that for so long, for decades, the Mexican repatriation, it was like swept under the rug. It wasn't talked about. You wouldn't find it in textbooks, not taught in schools.
Yeah.
Just this collective amnesia about this mass displacement of people, American citizens. It's hard to believe.
It is. It's like a blind spot in our history.
Yeah.
But the good news, I guess, is that more recently there's been this movement, to shine a light on what happened.
Yeah, thankfully, scholars, activists, people whose families were impacted by the repatriation, they've been working so hard to raise awareness, to make sure this injustice isn't forgotten.
And it's not just about, remembering the past, dwelling on something awful that happened. It's about seeing how it connects to the present, to right now. The Mexican repatriation, it's like this huge warning sign, this cautionary tale. It reminds us about the dangers of a scapegoating, of prejudice, and what happens when civil liberties, basic rights get chipped away, especially in tough times, when the economy's uncertain.
It makes you ask yourself the hard questions, How do we as a society, as a country, how do we learn from this, from the mistakes of the repatriation? How do we make sure that something like this blatant disregard for human beings, how do we make sure it never happens again?
Those are questions we all have to wrestle with, each and every one of us. Because the thing about history is it doesn't just repeat itself. It rhymes. It finds a way to echo. And I really believe it's up to us, all of us, to change the tune, to make sure those echoes don't lead us down the same dark path again.